If you sign that contract tonight, you won't have a company left by Christmas. The sentence was quiet, calm, almost gentle, but inside the private dining room of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, it landed like shattered glass. Every conversation stopped. Crystal chandeliers reflected against polished marble floors, while 14 executives turned toward the young waitress standing beside the wine cart. Ethan Blackwood slowly lifted his eyes from the $800 million acquisition agreement sitting in front of him. At 38, the billionaire founder of Blackwood Capital had built a reputation for seeing weaknesses before anyone else could. Investors feared him. Competitors studied him. Financial news networks called him the man who never missed. And yet now, a waitress barely older than 25 had just interrupted the biggest deal of his year. Claire Whitmore immediately realized every eye in the room was on her. Her fingers tightened slightly around the silver wine opener in her hand, but her face remained composed. That calmness irritated Ethan more than the interruption itself. Most people panicked under his attention. She didn't. One of the board members laughed first. Then another joined him. Soon the entire table was smiling into their bourbon glasses like they'd just witnessed the world's strangest comedy show. Well, one executive muttered, adjusting his Rolex, I guess Wall Street's hiring wait staff now. A few more chuckles followed. Claire lowered her eyes politely. My apologies, sir, she said softly. I didn't mean to interrupt. Ethan leaned back slowly in his leather chair, studying her. Blonde hair tied neatly behind her head. Simple black uniform. No jewelry except a thin silver bracelet worn smooth with age. She looked exactly like the hundreds of servers he barely noticed every year. And yet something about her expression felt wrong. Not arrogant. Not nervous either. Certain. Then why say it? Ethan asked coldly. Claire hesitated. Outside the towering glass windows, rain slid down the Manhattan skyline in silver streaks. Somewhere below, distant sirens echoed through the wet streets. Inside the room, nobody moved. Because your projected decay rate doesn't match the compounding structure in Section 4, she replied carefully. Silence. Ethan blinked once, then gave a short laugh under his breath. You read the contract? Only the page on the screen, sir. Another executive smirked. She probably heard a podcast. More laughter. Ethan reached for his whiskey, swirling the amber liquid slowly. And let me guess, he said. You just happened to calculate an advanced financial modeling error while serving Pinot Noir. Claire didn't answer immediately. She simply glanced toward the massive digital presentation glowing at the front of the room. Columns of numbers reflected faintly in her pale blue eyes. No, sir, she said quietly. I noticed because the denominator is mathematically impossible. The room fell silent again. This time longer. Ethan's amusement faded slightly. He sat forward. Impossible. Claire nodded once. Your analysts assumed a stable retention curve after month 18, she explained. But if the acquisition debt compounds quarterly instead of annually, your recovery window collapses 6 months earlier than projected. One of the younger analysts frowned and opened his laptop. Another executive straightened in his chair. Ethan stared at her without blinking now. You're guessing, he said finally. Claire looked down at the contract screen again, then slowly reached for the marker resting beside the digital board. No, sir, she said softly. I can show you. Claire stepped toward the illuminated glass board while the room watched her with open disbelief. The soft click of her shoes against the marble floor somehow sounded louder than the rain outside. Ethan remained seated, one hand resting against his whiskey glass, his sharp gray eyes following her every movement. He had spent 2 decades reading people for weakness, nervous habits, forced confidence, desperation hidden behind rehearsed smiles. But Claire Whitmore moved with the calm precision of someone who had already solved the problem long before speaking. That unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She picked up the black marker and studied the equation projected across the screen. Lines of projected revenue growth, debt leverage assumptions, market retention forecasts, $800 million balanced on mathematical optimism. Claire drew a single line through one number near the bottom of the model. Here, she said quietly. This is where everything starts breaking apart. One of the executives scoffed loudly. You cannot just walk into a financial meeting and rewrite an institutional model. Claire nodded politely. You are right, sir. Then she circled the quarterly compounding variable beside it. But this variable changes the entire timeline. Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. Around the table, several analysts leaned forward now despite themselves. Claire wrote slowly beneath the equation, explaining each adjustment with calm clarity. No dramatic gestures. No attempt to impress anyone. Just logic. Your team assumed customer retention stabilizes after 18 months, she explained. But the debt servicing costs rise every quarter. That means your recovery curve cannot flatten here. She pointed toward the projected graph glowing blue against the wall. It drops here instead. One of the younger analysts suddenly straightened in his chair. His fingers moved rapidly across his keyboard. Another executive stopped smiling entirely. Claire continued writing. By month 24, the acquisition begins consuming its own projected gains. Then the compounding pressure accelerates. Ethan slowly set his glass down. The soft clink echoed through the room. Nobody laughed now. Claire stepped aside slightly as the analyst at the far end of the table stared at his laptop screen. She is right, he said quietly. Nobody answered him at first. The analyst swallowed hard. The correction shifts the recovery window by 7 months. Another silence. Heavy this time. Ethan looked back toward the projection wall where millions of dollars in projected profit had suddenly transformed into risk exposure. For the first time that evening, uncertainty crossed his face. Small, brief, but real. Claire placed the marker down gently beside the screen. I apologize again for interrupting, she said softly. I just thought someone should notice before. You signed. Ethan stared at her for several long seconds. Then one of the older board members cleared his throat awkwardly. Where exactly did you learn to do this? Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. Community college mostly. The answer sounded rehearsed. Ethan noticed it immediately. He also noticed the almost invisible hesitation before she spoke. Tiny things. Most people miss tiny things. Ethan never did. Another executive gave a nervous laugh. That is some community college. But Claire simply lowered her eyes again. Calm. Polite. Untouchable. Ethan stood slowly from his chair and walked toward the glass board himself. At 6'3", dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit with silver cufflinks catching the chandelier light, he carried the kind of presence that usually controlled every room automatically. Yet standing beside Claire now, he felt something unfamiliar. Not intimidation. Something worse. Curiosity. His gaze moved across the corrected formulas again. Every number aligned perfectly. Every assumption accounted for. No guessing. No luck. Just precision. Ethan finally looked at her directly. How long have you worked here? Claire blinked softly, almost surprised by the question. 3 years, sir. Ethan glanced at the equations one more time, then back at her worn black waitress uniform. And in 3 years, he said quietly, nobody realized who you are? Claire gave the faintest smile. Sad somehow. Tired. No, sir, she replied softly. They only realized what I was. The room did not recover immediately after Claire spoke. Conversations that normally flowed effortlessly between billion-dollar executives now felt awkward and uneven, like musicians suddenly unsure of the song. Several board members quietly reopened their laptops while others pretended to study the wine list simply to avoid looking at Ethan Blackwood. Nobody wanted to acknowledge the uncomfortable truth sitting in the center of the room. A waitress had just caught a mistake their entire financial team missed. Claire stepped back toward the wine cart, clearly intending to disappear into the background again. But Ethan was still watching her. Closely now. The kind of attention that stripped people apart layer by layer. Run the revised model, he said suddenly without taking his eyes off her. One analyst hesitated. Right now? Ethan turned slowly. Does tomorrow sound less expensive to you? The analyst swallowed hard and immediately began typing again. Across the dining room, soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while rain continued sliding down the towering windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. The city looked blurred tonight. Silver lights melting through water. Somewhere below, yellow taxis crawled through wet Manhattan streets like reflections floating through glass. Claire quietly refilled a water glass near the end of the table as if none of this involved her anymore. Ethan noticed that too. No pride. No performance. Most people would have tried to capitalize on a moment like this. She looked almost uncomfortable receiving attention at all. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said calmly. Claire paused. Yes, sir. Sit down. Several executives immediately looked up in surprise. Claire blinked once. I am working. So am I. His tone remained even. Sit. A long silence followed. Then Claire slowly removed the order pad from her apron pocket and took the empty chair near the far end of the table. She sat carefully, posture straight, hands folded loosely in her lap. Ethan studied the tiny details automatically. No expensive manicure. No designer handbag. Her uniform sleeves were slightly faded near the wrists from years of washing. But her eyes remained steady. Intelligent. Alert. Walk me through it again, Ethan said. Claire glanced toward the projected model. The debt structure assumes stability too early, she explained quietly. Your analysts treated customer retention as linear growth. But retention changes under pricing pressure. One executive frowned. That still does not explain the collapse. Claire nodded politely. Then she reached for a linen napkin beside her untouched water glass and borrowed a pen from the table. She drew 3 clean lines. Fast. Precise. The problem is psychological before it is mathematical, she said softly. The room grew quiet again. People tolerate price increases during expansion phases. But once competitors react, customer behavior changes faster than your model predicts. Ethan leaned slightly forward now. Claire continued writing numbers across the napkin in neat handwriting. You projected a 7% drop. She circled the figure gently. Historically, markets under similar debt compression average closer to 19. One executive laughed nervously. That is impossible. Claire slid the napkin toward him. Actually, it already happened twice in the Seattle Telecom mergers. The executive stopped smiling. Ethan watched her carefully. Not just the intelligence now. The restraint. She never tried to embarrass anyone. Never raised her voice. Even while correcting people worth hundreds of millions of dollars, she somehow remained gracious. That bothered him in ways he could not explain. One analyst suddenly looked up from his laptop, pale-faced. She is right again. Silence spread across the table for the 3rd time that evening. Ethan slowly exhaled through his nose. Outside, thunder rolled faintly above the city skyline. Who taught you this? He asked quietly. Claire lowered her eyes to the napkin for a moment before answering. My father used to say numbers are honest, she replied softly. People just stop listening when the truth becomes inconvenient. Ethan stared at her for several long seconds. Then for the first time in years, the billionaire who trusted almost nobody felt something dangerous beginning to replace his skepticism. Respect. The revised numbers finished processing 6 minutes later. Nobody in the private dining room spoke while the updated projections loaded across the screen. The only sounds came from soft rain against the windows and the faint tapping of nervous fingers against crystal glasses. Then the final graph appeared. Red. Sharp. Unforgiving. The projected profit margin had collapsed by nearly 40%. One board member leaned back slowly in his chair and removed his glasses as though clearer vision might somehow change the outcome. Another quietly cursed under his breath. Ethan Blackwood remained standing beside the projection wall, expression unreadable, but inside he felt something. He hated more than failure itself. Exposure. If Claire had stayed silent tonight, he would have signed the acquisition before dessert. $800 million balanced on a mathematical flaw none of his analysts had caught. None except the waitress pouring wine. Ethan turned toward the table. Cancel the signing, he said calmly. Immediate protests followed. Ethan, we have investors flying in from Chicago tomorrow morning. The press release is already drafted. This will create market speculation. Ethan lifted one hand slightly. Silence returned instantly. Then let them speculate, he said coldly. I would rather look cautious than incompetent. Nobody argued after that. Claire quietly stood from her chair, intending once again to disappear before attention found her a second time. But Ethan spoke before she could leave. Miss Whitmore. She paused near the wine cart. Yes, sir. Ethan glanced toward the linen napkin still covered in her handwritten calculations. You saw that error in less than 30 seconds. Claire lowered her eyes modestly. Patterns become obvious when you study them long enough. How long exactly? Ethan asked. Claire hesitated this time. A real hesitation. A few years. Ethan noticed the answer carefully avoided specifics. Again, he had built an empire by recognizing when people were hiding something. Claire Whitmore carried secrets the way some people carried jewelry. Quietly. Constantly. One of the executives suddenly laughed awkwardly, trying to ease the tension. Well, perhaps Blackwood Capital should start recruiting directly from the wait staff. A few forced smiles appeared around the table. Claire simply reached for the empty glasses. "Would anyone like more wine?" she asked softly. Ethan watched the room react to her. Some embarrassed, some defensive, some curious now. But Claire behaved exactly the same as before. Calm, professional, untouched by approval. That fascinated him more than her intelligence. Most people change the moment powerful men notice them. She seemed determined not to. As dinner slowly resumed, Ethan found his attention drifting toward her repeatedly. The way she moved through the room with quiet efficiency, the way she listened more than she spoke. Even the way she carried herself felt disciplined somehow. Not rehearsed elegance. Something stronger. Restraint. Near the end of the evening, Ethan stepped away from the table to take a phone call near the hallway overlooking the city. His chief financial officer sounded shaken. "The revised model is already circulating internally," the man said through the speaker. "Who caught it?" Ethan looked back through the glass doors toward Claire. She was helping an elderly couple near the far side of the restaurant now, smiling politely while adjusting a candle that had burned too low. Simple. Ordinary. Invisible to almost everyone else in the room. "Someone we completely underestimated," Ethan replied quietly. He ended the call and remained standing there for a moment. Rainwater streaked down the windows beside him while headlights blurred across Lexington Avenue below. Behind him, the dinner guests slowly recovered from the humiliation of being corrected by a waitress. But Ethan could not shake the feeling settling deeper into his mind. Claire Whitmore did not belong in this restaurant. Not because serving tables was beneath her, because she carried herself like someone who had already survived the collapse of something much bigger than money. When Ethan finally returned to the private room, he noticed Claire placing the corrected napkin carefully beside his leather portfolio instead of throwing it away. "You should keep that," she said softly. Ethan looked down at the handwritten equations. "Why?" Claire gave a faint smile that barely reached her tired blue eyes. "Because people rarely remember the moment they were praised," she replied quietly. "But they always remember the moment they almost lost everything." The dinner ended almost an hour earlier than planned. Executives who normally lingered over 12-year bourbon and quiet negotiations now gathered their coats in uncomfortable silence, avoiding eye contact as they stepped out into the rainy Manhattan night. One by one, black luxury sedans disappeared beneath the glow of wet streetlights outside Lumiere. Ethan Blackwood remained behind. He stood, alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city while restaurant staff quietly reset tables around him. The corrected financial model still occupied his thoughts like an unanswered question. Not the mistake itself. Him missing it. Across the dining room, Claire Whitmore carefully folded linen napkins beside the service station as though nothing unusual had happened tonight. Ethan watched her for several moments before speaking. "You should not still be working." Claire glanced up briefly. "Neither should you." The answer caught him off guard. Not disrespectful. Honest. Ethan almost smiled before stopping himself. Most people would have spent the last hour telling everyone how smart they are. Claire returned to aligning silverware with precise movements. Most people need to. Ethan slowly walked closer. The soft shine of chandelier light reflected against the polished black floor beneath them, while jazz music drifted quietly through hidden speakers overhead. For the first time in years, he found himself unsure how to continue a conversation. That irritated him. "You said your father taught you numbers," he said finally. Claire's hands paused for the smallest moment, then continued folding the napkin. "Yes." "Was he a professor?" "No," she gave a faint smile. "Mechanic." Ethan frowned slightly. "A mechanic taught you advanced financial modeling?" Claire looked toward the rain outside the windows. "He taught me patterns," she said quietly. "Engines fail for the same reason companies do. People ignore small problems because fixing them feels inconvenient." Ethan studied her face carefully. There it was again. The strange mixture of intelligence and exhaustion hidden behind her calm expression. "You did not learn all this from a mechanic." Claire lowered her eyes. "No." Another silence settled between them. But this one felt different from the earlier tension inside the boardroom. Softer somehow. More dangerous. Ethan was not accustomed to mystery he could not immediately solve. And Claire Whitmore had become exactly that. Near the front entrance, the restaurant manager approached nervously. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "you can head home after. Table 12 closes out." Claire nodded politely. "Thank you." Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a business card embossed with silver lettering. Blackwood Capital. His private number handwritten beneath it. "Come work for me," he said simply. Claire looked at the card but did not take it immediately. "You are offering me a job after one conversation? I am offering you an opportunity after you saved me $800 million. Claire finally accepted the card between slender fingers but made no move to read it. "You assume I want that kind of life." Ethan almost laughed softly. "Most people do." Claire slipped the card into her apron pocket. "Most people think money fixes the part of life that hurts." Ethan's expression shifted slightly. The words landed harder than he expected. Before he could answer, Claire glanced toward the elderly couple near the front of the restaurant. Their check had arrived, and the husband was struggling to calculate the tip while adjusting thick reading glasses with trembling hands. Without another word, Claire walked over and quietly helped them split the bill between two credit cards while speaking gently enough that they would not feel embarrassed. Ethan remained standing alone near the windows watching her. She moved through the restaurant the same way she had moved through the financial equations earlier. Patiently, carefully, like someone accustomed to carrying more weight than anyone realized. The elderly woman squeezed Claire's hand gratefully before leaving. Claire smiled warmly, then returned toward the service station. Ethan noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath her composure now. Tiny details, faint shadows beneath her eyes, the stiffness in her shoulders when she thought nobody was looking. This was not temporary hardship. This was survival. "Why are you really here?" Ethan asked quietly when she returned. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind them while distant thunder rolled somewhere above the East River. "Because hospitals do not accept potential," she replied softly. "They accept payments." And for the first time that night, Ethan Blackwood realized the woman standing in front of him was not hiding ambition. She was hiding sacrifice. Claire finished her shift just after midnight. By then, the storm over Manhattan had softened into a cold drizzle that painted the sidewalks silver beneath the streetlights. Inside Lumiere, chairs rested upside down on polished tables, while the last kitchen staff disappeared through the back hallway one by one. Ethan Blackwood remained seated alone near the windows, his untouched espresso growing cold beside him. He had canceled billion-dollar negotiations before. He had dismantled companies with fewer emotions than most people used ordering coffee. But somehow, the quiet waitress folding napkins across the room had unsettled him more in a single evening than entire boardrooms full of rivals ever had. Claire removed her apron slowly and tucked it into her locker behind the service station. When she turned back around, Ethan was already standing near the entrance waiting. "You stayed," she said softly. "You noticed." Claire slipped on a charcoal wool coat that looked older than the rest of her clothes. "Most people with your schedule do not wait around restaurants after midnight." Ethan opened the glass door for her without answering immediately. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the scent of rain and distant traffic. "Most people did not save me from making the worst financial mistake of my career tonight." Claire stepped onto the sidewalk beneath the restaurant awning. The city around them glowed with reflections. Yellow cabs rolled through wet intersections while steam curled upward from subway grates in pale clouds. Ethan walked beside her quietly as she started down Lexington Avenue. "You do not need to walk me home," Claire said after a moment. "Probably not." "Then why are you?" Ethan glanced toward her. "Because I think you are lying to me." Claire almost smiled at that. "About what?" "Everything except the math." She looked ahead again without answering. Her apartment was nearly 40 minutes downtown by subway, but she preferred walking the first several blocks after work. It gave her time to think before returning to reality. Bills, hospital, forms, medication schedules, things numbers could not always fix. Ethan noticed she kept rubbing her right wrist absent-mindedly beneath her coat sleeve. Exhaustion, stress, tiny tells most people missed. "Who was in the hospital?" he asked quietly. Claire stopped walking for the first time. Traffic lights reflected across her pale blue eyes while rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the awning above them. "My younger brother," she answered softly after several seconds. Ethan waited. "Congenital heart condition," Claire continued. "He has surgery scheduled in 2 months." Her voice remained calm, but Ethan noticed how tightly she folded her arms against herself afterward. Protective, like even speaking about it cost energy she could not spare. And insurance is not covering everything. It was not a question. Claire shook her head once. Insurance covers enough to keep people hopeful. Ethan looked away briefly toward the passing traffic. He knew numbers, markets, risk. But there was always something uniquely ugly about watching intelligent people drown slowly beneath medical bills in a country filled with private jets and rooftop penthouses. How much? He asked quietly. Claire immediately stiffened. No, Ethan frowned slightly. You do not even know what I was offering. Yes, I do. Her answer came gently but firmly. And I am grateful. But I do not want charity. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. You corrected a financial model my senior analysts approved. You could probably outperform half my strategy department. Claire gave a tired smile. That still does not mean I want someone rescuing me. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying colder rain through the street. Claire pulled her coat tighter while Ethan instinctively stepped slightly closer to shield her from the weather. Neither of them mentioned it. You know what the strange part is? Ethan said after a long silence. Claire looked up at him. Most people spend years trying to get my attention. His gray eyes held her steadily now. And you have spent the entire night trying to avoid it. Claire looked down toward the wet sidewalk between them. For the first time since he met her, Ethan saw something flicker through her composure. Not fear exactly. Sadness. Attention is expensive, she said quietly. Eventually, it always wants something back. The words lingered between them while rain continued falling softly over Manhattan. And standing there beneath the pale glow of midnight streetlights, Ethan Blackwood realized Claire Whitmore was not afraid of powerful men because she was weak. She was afraid because experience had taught her exactly how quickly admiration could become ownership. Claire insisted on taking the subway alone after that. Ethan offered his driver once. She refused once. Neither repeated themselves. By the time she disappeared down the station stairs near 42nd Street, rainwater glimmered along the edges of her coat, while the silver business card remained untouched inside her apron pocket. Ethan stood there longer than necessary, watching the empty subway entrance. Manhattan never truly slept. Taxis hissed across wet pavement. Steam drifted through the cold night air. Somewhere nearby, laughter spilled from a rooftop bar filled with people who probably believed money solved loneliness. Ethan usually belonged in rooms like that. Tonight, he felt strangely disconnected from all of it. The next morning began before sunrise. By 6:30, Blackwood Capital's top analysts filled the 48th floor conference room overlooking Midtown. Coffee steamed beside glowing monitors while revised acquisition reports spread across the massive walnut table. Ethan entered carrying only one folded linen napkin, Claire's handwritten equations. Several executives immediately straightened in their seats. We spent all night rebuilding the model, one analyst reported nervously. The waitress was correct about everything. Ethan said nothing at first. He simply placed the folded napkin at the center of the table, like evidence no one wanted to examine too closely. Her name is Claire Whitmore, he said calmly. And she saw in 30 seconds what this entire floor missed for 3 weeks. No one spoke. Embarrassment settled heavily across the room. Ethan looked around slowly. Do you know why? Silence. Then one executive finally cleared his throat. With respect, Ethan, nobody expected financial analysis from restaurant staff. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Exactly. The answer lingered in the room uncomfortably. A young associate near the far end opened a folder carefully. We looked into her background this morning. Ethan's eyes lifted immediately. And very little exists after college. The associate hesitated. But before that, he slid a printed article across the table. Ethan picked it up slowly. Massachusetts Institute of Technology National Mathematics Fellowship. Claire Whitmore, age 21. The attached photograph showed a younger Claire standing beside a whiteboard filled with equations, pale blonde hair falling loosely around her shoulders while reporters crowded nearby. Her smile in the picture looked different somehow. Lighter, untouched by exhaustion. Another article followed. International Quantitative Finance Competition. First place. Another. Academic publication in predictive market volatility at only 22 years old. Ethan stared silently at the documents. Why would someone like this disappear into restaurant work? Nobody answered. One analyst adjusted his glasses nervously. There is more. Ethan looked up. Her mother passed away 4 years ago. Medical debt forced her to leave graduate school. Her younger brother developed a congenital cardiac condition shortly afterward. The room grew quiet again. Ethan glanced back down at the articles spread before him. Mathematical prodigy, national awards, research publications. And now she spent her nights pouring wine for executives who laughed at her before realizing she was smarter than all of them. Something about that unsettled him deeply. There is one more thing, the associate added carefully. Her former professors described her as exceptional. One of them called her the most naturally gifted financial theorist he had seen in 20 years. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. Through the towering windows behind him, morning sunlight finally began breaking through Manhattan's gray clouds in pale streaks of gold. And now she works double shifts to pay hospital bills, he said quietly. Nobody responded. Because there was nothing intelligent to say. Ethan stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the city below. Thousands of people moved through streets already crowded with ambition and survival. Most would never notice someone like Claire Whitmore. Not because she lacked brilliance. Because the world had trained itself to only recognize intelligence when it arrived wearing expensive suits. Cancel my afternoon meetings, Ethan said suddenly. Several executives looked startled. All of them. Yes. He slipped Claire's folded napkin carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. Where are you going? One board member asked. Ethan looked back toward the room with an expression none of them recognized immediately. Determination softened by something quieter. Something human. To find the smartest person in New York, he replied calmly. Before another restaurant does. Claire was not at Lumiere that afternoon. Ethan learned that within 30 seconds of arriving at the restaurant. She requested the day off, the manager explained nervously while straightening menus that did not need straightening. Family matter. Ethan nodded once, but did not leave immediately. Something about the empty space behind the service station felt strangely noticeable now. The polished glasses. The folded linen napkins. The quiet absence of the one person who had changed the direction of an $800 million decision with a borrowed marker and a calm voice. Do you know where she went? Ethan asked casually. The manager hesitated. I probably should not say. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and placed a simple black business card on the counter. No threat. No pressure. Just his name embossed in silver. The manager swallowed. St. Andrew Medical Center on East 34th. Ethan arrived 20 minutes later. Hospitals always smelled the same regardless of wealth. Antiseptic. Coffee gone cold. Fear hidden beneath polite smiles. He walked through bright white corridors filled with exhausted families and flickering vending machines until he finally spotted Claire near the pediatric cardiac wing. She sat alone beside a window holding 2 paper cups of coffee, while reading through a stack of insurance documents highlighted with handwritten notes. Her hair was loosely tied back today, and without the restaurant lighting or uniform, she somehow looked younger and more tired at the same time. Ethan stopped walking for a moment before approaching. Claire looked up almost immediately. Surprise crossed her face first. Then caution. You followed me, she asked softly. I asked where you were. Ethan glanced toward the paperwork in her lap. You should not have to do all this alone. Claire folded the documents closed instinctively. People usually do. Ethan sat beside her without asking permission. Across the hallway, a nurse gently guided a little boy pushing an 4-stand decorated with superhero stickers. The child laughed weakly while his mother tried not to cry watching him walk. Claire stared quietly at the scene for several seconds before speaking again. His surgery is in 8 weeks, she said softly. Ethan looked at her. Your brother? She nodded once. Daniel. The name carried enormous tenderness despite how carefully she tried to hide it. He is 19. Pretends he is not scared, so I worry less. Ethan leaned back slightly in the uncomfortable hospital chair. And are you scared? Claire smiled faintly without humor. Every day. Silence settled between them while distant monitor sounds echoed softly through the hallway. Ethan noticed how organized her paperwork was. Payment plans. Appeal letters. Medication schedules. Every page color-coded with mathematical precision. Survival through structure. You really planned all of this alone, he murmured. Claire shrugged gently. Numbers are easier than uncertainty. Ethan looked toward her carefully. You could have had a very different life, Claire. She gave a quiet laugh at that. Everybody keeps saying that. Because it is true. Claire turned toward the rain-covered window beside them. Do you know what the strange thing about intelligence is? She asked softly. Ethan waited. People think it protects you from suffering. Her fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup. It does not. It just makes you aware of exactly how much everything costs. Ethan did not answer immediately because for once he had no polished response prepared. No strategic solution. Just the uncomfortable recognition that she was right. A nurse suddenly approached carrying a clipboard. Miss Whitmore. Claire stood immediately. How is he? Awake and asking for you. Relief flashed across Claire's face so quickly it almost hurt to witness. She looked back toward Ethan awkwardly. You do not have to stay. Ethan rose slowly from the chair. I know. Claire studied him carefully for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether powerful men were ever capable of kindness without conditions attached. Then she finally nodded toward the hallway. Come meet him, she said quietly. Ethan followed her through the cardiac wing beneath pale fluorescent lights. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who controlled entire financial markets realized there were places in life where money stopped being power and simply became hope. Daniel Whitmore turned out to be nothing like Ethan expected. The 19-year-old lying in the hospital bed wore an oversized Boston Red Sox hoodie and greeted Ethan with a grin wide enough to brighten the entire room despite the heart monitor softly beeping beside him. So you are the billionaire my sister accidentally embarrassed? Daniel asked immediately. Claire closed her eyes briefly in embarrassment. Daniel. Ethan surprised himself by laughing quietly. Accidentally is generous. Daniel smiled weakly and extended a hand. Nice to meet you, Mr. Blackwood. Ethan is fine. Ethan shook his hand carefully, noticing how thin his wrist felt beneath the hospital bracelet. But Daniel's eyes carried the same intelligence as Claire's. Sharp. Observant. Impossible to underestimate once you looked closely enough. Claire talks about numbers the way normal people talk about sports, Daniel said. When we were kids, she used to solve math competitions for fun while making macaroni and cheese. Claire adjusted his blanket gently. You are supposed to be resting. I am resting. Daniel pointed toward Ethan. This is entertainment. Ethan leaned lightly against the window beside the bed while rain continued tapping softly against the glass outside. The hospital room itself was simple. A small television mounted near the ceiling. A vase holding fresh grocery store flowers. Insurance paperwork stacked neatly beside a backpack full of engineering textbooks. Ethan noticed Claire had highlighted entire sections for Daniel already. Even here, she was still solving problems before anyone asked her to. Your sister saved me from a catastrophic acquisition, Ethan said calmly. Daniel looked completely unsurprised. Sounds like her. Claire rolled her eyes softly. Please stop making me sound mythical. You kind of are, Daniel replied. Ethan watched the exchange quietly. The exhaustion Claire carried seemed lighter around her brother somehow. Not gone, just softened. Like caring for someone else gave her permission to forget herself for a few minutes. A doctor entered shortly afterward carrying updated test results. Claire immediately stood. How does everything look? The doctor smiled reassuringly. Stable. We still need surgery on schedule, but his numbers are holding better than expected. Claire visibly exhaled. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But Ethan saw it. Relief mixed with fear. Hope balanced against bills she still could not fully pay. After the doctor left, Daniel glanced between them knowingly. You know, he said casually. Claire turned down a hedge fund internship once because it conflicted with my physical therapy appointments. Claire looked horrified. Daniel. What? He shrugged carefully against the pillows. You act like sacrificing your entire future was normal. Ethan looked toward Claire slowly. You never mentioned that. Claire avoided his eyes while organizing medication papers that were already organized. It was not important. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Not important. Claire finally looked up. People romanticize sacrifice when they are not the ones living inside it. The room fell quiet after that. Even Daniel stopped smiling for a moment. Ethan understood suddenly that Claire did not see herself as extraordinary. She saw herself as necessary. Like every dream she gave up had simply been another bill getting paid. Another problem solved quietly. Before anyone else noticed, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded linen napkin from Lumiere, the one covered in Claire's handwritten calculations. He placed it gently on the bedside table beside Daniel's flowers. Claire frowned slightly. Why do you still have that? Ethan looked at her steadily. Because it reminds me how dangerous it is to judge people by where you find them. Daniel picked up the napkin